My name is Melissa Franklin. I'm a physics professor, and I share the distinguishing quality with Mara Prentiss, our speaker, of being one of the 5 or 10 Mallinckrodt professors of physics. Mallinckrodt was a very rich man, or possibly he was a rich woman, or he had a rich wife. Anyway, Mara, this is really exciting to be able to introduce Mara. And I apologize, by the way, for having the talk on Yom Kippur, but I know for sure that I will be, my apology will be accepted. So, to all the people that aren't here. So, Mara is a colleague of mine, and she came to the physics department. First, she was an undergrad at Wellesley, a grad student at MIT. She was a postdoctoral researcher at Bell Labs, AT&T Bell Labs, famous, best place in the world, where she was doing atomic physics, and she was on the leading edge of photolithography, putting down one atom at a time and writing her name. And strangely, then, after doing atomic physics for about 10 years, she became interested in biophysics, and now she's doing very, very interesting work in biophysics with chromosomes and DNA, using some of the same tools that she had in atomic physics. At the same time, during all this time, she has been advising the government on everything from you name it to you can't talk about it. Is that about right?
That sums it up, but we can't talk about it.
We can't talk about it. No, honestly, for instance, one thing here we have is a study, a survey of issues, components, systems, and opportunities for detectors of biological and chemical warfare. So Mara has been spending a lot of time making the world safe. So she also has very many wonderful things, but the thing I like best on her CV is that she won the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Prize here at Harvard, and she's won also mentoring prizes. So those are very important things at the university. So today, Mara is not going to talk about either of the things she knows a lot about, but she knows a lot about everything. She previously knew a lot about, she clearly knows a lot about this, but she's going to talk about what's in her new book about energy. And she actually has taught courses at Harvard on this subject, and she has recently, in the past 5 years, become a leading expert. And so actually, this is very, very fun. Mara is obviously brilliant. After reading this, after just listening to my own introduction, I'd have to say she's brilliant, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk.
Thank you very much. This is a position that's usual for me. Melissa was the first woman in the physics department, and I was the second. So I spend my life following right behind you, only slightly shorter. So I'm really excited to be here with you tonight because a combination of technological, social, and environmental factors are combined to create the possibility of revolutionizing the relationship that we have with energy. And tonight I'm going to give you a few examples of changes that we can make that will enhance our lives now, and which I hope will have a large positive impact on people for generations in the future. So my suggestions have 3 major areas. One is that we change the energy sources that we're using and shift toward renewables. A second is we change the devices that we use to consume energy. And a third is that we take advantage of huge improvements in computation in order to make ourselves more comfortable and use less energy at the same time. So what do I mean about opportunities? Well, this graph gives an example of one sort of opportunity. So what this graph shows is that of all the energy we extract, we waste a huge amount of it, about 61%. And when I'm talking about wasted energy in this graph, I don't mean the fact that my daughter leaves the lights on in her room before she goes to class, or that my in-laws drive around a lot before they find a useful parking space. That actually falls under the green portion of used energy. It may be used badly, but it's used. Wasted energy here means energy that fundamentally can't be used. It turns out there's a basic law of physics that governs how efficient heat engines can be. And you might say, well, who cares? Well, it turns out that internal combustion engines and the turbines in burning power plants are heat engines. And that limit means that we can't do much better than this. And no matter how great your engineering is, you're sort of stuck here. But there's a lot of hope in this picture, too, because if we change technologies, we can change that altogether. If we change to electric cars and we extract the energy from renewables, then that means that the energy we need from renewables is only this green fraction. This part that we're wasting, we don't need to use at all. So by making a change, we can use way less. And furthermore, since this green includes all those forms that are nominally used but are actually wasted, if we can actually have energy improvements, we could bring down the energy we use to as low as 20% without changing our lifestyle and possibly even with improving it. So I'm really excited about this possibility. But one of the things I wanted to do is to give you a clear example of where these numbers came from. One of the reasons I got into this was that I read things on the internet that I found to be utterly wacky, and not the stuff about Elvis's love child or anything, but these other factors about how much renewable energy you need to do this, that, and the other thing. So one of the things I did was provide a source for all the information I used. So this graph actually comes from this fabulous chart which is made by Lawrence Livermore National Labs. And depending on how your prescription is and how far back you're sitting, you may or not be able to read any of this. And I'm not going to drone on by reading all of it to you. I just want to introduce it to you as an overview. At this left side are energy sources. So this is petroleum, coal, and natural gas, for example. So this is where we get our energy originally. And as you move to the right, it's what we use it for. So there's electricity generation, transportation, et cetera. And then the final set over here is how much we use. So electricity generation, we waste a lot. The orange is what we actually are able to use, and the gray is what we waste. So this gray factor is where those numbers over there come from. It's what's wasted. And I hope that you spend a nice evening in a comfortable chair with a glass of Chardonnay in front of a high-efficiency fireplace using LED lights to read this to your heart's content. But in case you never get that far, I have a little Monarch Notes version for you, and I'm offering it here. So one is, where does all this waste go? Well, you can see that industry isn't so bad. They're about 80% efficient. Residential is 75%. Electric power is horrible, and transport is really horrible. And that's what I was telling you before. These are the power plants and the internal combustion engines that lose all that heat. So a quick lesson here is that you want to avoid heat engines. So where do we currently get our energy? This is what it looks like. We use roughly equal amounts of petroleum and natural gas. Then we use coal. And then there's a mix of other energy sources in here. The unnerving part is that 83% of this is fossil fuel burning. And I argue that we can get rid of the vast majority of that. So to say we have to get rid of it, I have to explain what it is we do with it. So this is a graph of what we do with it. This is electric power, and remember that has the burning problem. Transport has the burning problem. So this is a big piece of the graph where we can make a big improvement. And below here, I just show what we use it for. We use petroleum for transportation, nuclear and coal for electricity, and natural gas is spread over everything. Natural gas is something whose use has been increasing, and it's a utility player that's used widely everywhere. And it's likely to be the last fossil fuel standing. So I want to answer the question, how did we get here? How did we end up at that mix of energies? If I'm arguing we're going to change them, it's worth saying how we got there. Well, Theda Skocpol, who has been a professor here, once said, you have to appreciate history to understand where you are. And she's a very wise woman, but I have a more mundane reason for doing this, and that's to make the following argument. If I argue we can make a change, you and I can get into it, oh, but you can change, you can't change, people can't quit smoking, blah, 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 and we can waste many happy hours fighting about this. But an alternative is to say we've already changed, that I can show we can do this because it's already happened. So I'm going to give you a brief history of US energy to show that we can change. So this is a graph showing US energy since the founding of Harvard. And many people locally view that as the beginning of time. But for those who don't, you can just consider it the beginning of the graph. And so you can see that nothing much happens. And then sort of around the Civil War, energy use starts to take off. And then it explodes. And you can see there's just this huge increase in energy with time. And there are two little blips. There's the Great Depression, which people who lived through it probably would not describe as a little blip. And there's the oil shock here. But the really interesting thing is that recently we've actually peaked. And I would argue this is one of the first signs that the revolution is already here. We are already changing the way that we use energy. So I argued that I wanted to show you that we've already changed energy sources. So this is one way of looking at it. So here I've divided the energy consumption by source. So wood is shown here. You can see it peaks around the Civil War, and then it actually went down. We started using less wood, and we began to use more coal. So the early age here, you could argue, is the age of wood. We have the age of coal, and now we've entered the diversified era where we use a whole lot of different energy sources. So for wood, it ceased to be the dominant one because we used less of it. But coal, you'll notice we're using more than ever. It's changed because we're using more of everything else, too. It's that explosion in energy. We're using fractionally less coal because we're using so much more of everything else. And can you see that in this graph? This is the percentage we used. So early on, it's 100% wood, wood tanks. There's this spike of coal. And now we're into this era where we have mix. And I argue that for the foreseeable future, we're going to be living in this diversified era. There isn't going to be any dominant source. We're going to combine a variety of sources to try to meet our needs. So I've shown you some examples of change. This is a very positive change that's happened, and that is the amount of dollars per GDP. Many people argue if you stop using energy, you're going to have a crisis. But this green line shows shows energy use per GDP dollar. And you can see it's going steadily down. It has been for a long time. It peaked sometime around 1950. So for the lives of many people in this room, there's been a steady decline. So decreasing energy use doesn't necessarily mean a disaster for the economy. Secondly, this is energy use per capita. And you notice it peaked somewhere in the mid-70s and has become steady and is projected to go down. This is a huge change. That inexorable growth that we were seeing is altering, and our needs are changing fundamentally. So if we ask the question, can we change? I argue we already have. We've changed the sources that we use, and we changed how much we're consuming. In earlier eras, we had this large rise. There was a leveling out. And then for the last 20 years, we've stayed constant, even with the population increase. This is the total energy we consume. We've already begun to change our lives. So fine, we've made these different kinds of changes. As I talk about changes in the future, I'm going to divide them into passive changes and active changes. So what does that mean? This does not mean couch potatoes versus gym rats. What I'm referring to is whether we're making changes in passive things, which are energy we don't consume. So passive changes are alterations we make not to use energy. And this was the cutting edge of about 3000 BC. So we're right up to the modern era here. And basically what it is a clay pot with water in it. And as the water evaporates, it's cold. So it's a way of making a refrigerator without consuming energy. And of course, this is a fancy triple pane window. And this is, I think, one of the earliest buildings in California, showing a very thick, well-insulated wall. And this is Israeli solar energy. And this is passive efforts in Greece. You know, why are buildings in Greece white? Well, they're pretty and attract tourists, and at the moment that could be their dominant factor. However, when they built these, they had other issues, and one of them was not getting too hot. So if you're in a hot place and you paint a building white, you get less hot. You may wonder why Americans love those black roofs. So in the next 20 years, you may be seeing white roofs springing up everywhere. And this is a lovely project. It's a way of lighting a room using a 1-liter soda bottle. It turns out that you can light a small room just putting a soda bottle in the roof. And I think it's a beautiful example of clever engineering. So all these are examples of exploiting energy and conserving energy without changing how we use it. But active options are good too. And we have 2 options. One is evolution, and one is revolution. And I'm going to argue that we need both. So what is evolution and what is revolution? Well, evolution are iterative changes. If you think about cars, anybody watch the Thin Man movies, for example? Their life looks sort of the same. They drive cars over bridges, they fly in planes, but they're really different then than they were now. If you look at the miles driven per vehicle, they've gone drastically up, but you can see that the fuel consumption has actually gone down. So we're driving way more miles and using much less energy. And I don't think anyone would argue that the Model T is a better car than the current Tesla. And besides, the Model T did not have cup holders, GPS, or MP3 players. So I would argue that there's been a big reduction in energy use, which has been accompanied by an improvement in creature comfort. And this is another example. These are chargers. So I'm sure you have a lot of these around. I don't know if some of you are old enough to have used these old-style chargers. They were big and clunky and heavy. If you open them up, they're full of copper wire. So they're expensive, they're highly inefficient, and they only work in one type of power system. So if you plug them in the US, it's good. If you plug them in Europe, they fry. So they were very limited objects. They're hard to put in your luggage. These are sort of a current charger. They're small, they're light, they're very energy efficient, and you can plug them in anywhere in the world. You need a different plug, but they'll actually function anywhere. That is a huge improvement in functionality. Even Vice President Cheney would be happy to embrace this shift as a change in energy. It's a way of being happier and using less energy. And I want to find as many examples like this as possible, where it's not about turning down the heat and freezing in your little hovel. It's about living more comfortably in your wide space while still using less energy. So what I'm proposing is an all-electric revolution, that we change our sources to be renewable energy sources, that we change the devices that we use, and that we use smart systems to make us more comfortable. So why do we want to do this? Well, one reason is national security. A lot of countries of whom we're not terribly fond are large exporters of energy. And so we're sending a lot of money, and our allies are sending a lot of money to people we would rather not support. Balance of payments is an issue. There are huge issues with the environment. And here I'm referring to various sorts of pollution. There's climate change, health, and flexibility. Energy sources right now aren't that interchangeable. If my cell phone dies, it doesn't help me that I have a can of gasoline. I can't interchange one for the other. But if we have a way of making all energy exchangeable, then we have many more choices in storage and distribution. So this gives us tremendous flexibility. So if you're about to launch off into a micro-sleep, and I see a couple people sort of nodding off, I'm hoping it's jet lag. So I want to do a little summary here. Burning is bad. So why is burning bad? Well, there's the Carnot efficiency I mentioned. Heat engines just can't be very efficient. 2, burning emits lots of bad things. 3 is the carbon that goes into climate change. 4 is heat dumping. If you're near a power plant, for example, they usually dump heat into the river, so it actually changes the local ecosystem. Extraction is a problem. Remember Deepwater Horizons and mine fires and all sorts of things. Getting it out is not fun. And then you have to move it places, and sometimes that doesn't go well. There are pipeline problems. There was the Exxon Valdez. All of these are bad. If we get rid of burning, they're all gone. And so I propose we stop doing this and we do something different. And I'm only going to make one detailed argument because it's the argument that dominates the developing world. A lot of people say, well, why change in the developed world? Because they're just going to make a mess anyway, and who cares? And that's many people's attitudes, but I argue that people in the developing world are very sensitive to not being able to breathe. It's an odd feature, this desire to put air in your lungs. And you can see that it's challenging in a lot of places. You may remember the Beijing Olympics. The advice was, don't breathe during the marathon. Hard. So they know that they have an air pollution problem. And you can see how this is connected with burning fuels. So I've made a chart of major pollutants, and you can see that power plants dominate sulfur dioxide. So that's what gives you acid rain, for example. Transport, which is cars, et cetera, dominates all of these categories. It's a big contributor. So if we do away with burning, we can reduce a lot of these issues. So what would prevent us from changing? Well, one is social factors. Do we want to change? Some people very desperately, fervently believe that we need to change now. And some people are unconvinced. A second issue is technological feasibility. Great, we want to change, but we can't. This is the weight loss category for many people, for example. We know we want to do it, but we just can't quite. And the other one is, can we afford it? Is it too expensive? And a lot of people argue that we can't afford to do it. And in my talk, I'm going to emphasize this one because it's what I do, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the other two as well. So again, I'm suggesting that we change everything to electricity. So what's the role of burning right now? What do we have to change? And the answer is we have to change a lot. This is the annual electricity generation. This is coal, this big black mass. And then this is, I believe, petroleum and natural gas. So we've got a lot of burning going on. And this is renewable sources and nuclear. So we have to change a lot. So one question is, can we? Do we have enough energy? And the answer is, yes, we do. We have more than enough energy to switch 100% of our current energy, not just the electricity. Every single bit of energy we use, we could get from renewables. But we do have a long way to go. This is where we are. This is the total. This is the renewable fraction. On the other hand, we've come a long way. The changes have been large. This is a graph showing renewable energy. So you can see that hydroelectric increased radically, and then it stopped increasing. I'm going to tell you and show you in some detail, we can't get any more hydroelectric. There is no more. This is it. The reason it's peaked out is because there is no more. And if you look at it as a percentage, it's plummeted, even though the rate is constant, because we've become so much more piggish, the fraction it contributes has gone way down. So hydro isn't contributing much anymore, but there's been a revolution in wind and solar. This is this huge increase in wind, and now there's been a vast increase in solar. So again, to some extent, the revolution is already here, and I'm behind the curve. So how do we know we have enough? Well, physicists love scaling laws, and George Whitesides is a very famous, important chemist, and he says only physicists love scaling laws, and he recommends that when I talk to any audience that is not full of physics PhDs that I never, ever mention it. So I'm going out on a limb here to mention it briefly. And so if you look at renewable energy, it basically all comes from solar power. The wind blows because of differences in heat. Solar obviously produces the sun. It also produces hydro. So one way of asking if you have enough energy is, do you get enough sunlight in your space? So you can figure out how much sunlight you need to give the total power in the US. And this is what it turns out to be, about 1/3 of a watt per meter squared. And this is what's required for electrical power. And you say, who cares? But you can figure out how much sunlight we get. And it's way, way more. It's about 100 times more. So we could get 100% of all energy use in the United States on 1% of the land. And it's even better than that if you take into account what we waste by burning. And so you can see wind is about 15%, and again, less if we count that. But hydro is a non-starter. We can't get any more hydro than we have. So why do people love hydro? Well, it makes really cool pictures, and it offers good storage. So how does hydro work? Well, rain falls down, and then water falls from a height and makes a wheel turn. and then eventually the water is evaporated up by the sun, and it goes around like this. So that's why hydro is really solar energy. This is a somewhat more realistic picture of a hydroelectric dam. Unfortunately, they don't let the cool water fall all the way down because it's actually really inefficient, sorry. Though it is good for kayakers and stuff, and every so often they'll open it up so people can have fun. But basically, if they're being energy conserving, they simply let water pressure turn a turbine down here and then go into the river. So that's how it really looks. And the important points are the higher the dam, the more energy you have. As you lift a weight higher, when you drop it, it's more likely to smash your foot. So higher dams are good, and you want more water in them. But there's a limit to how much you can do, and if all the water falling in the United States were put behind 100-meter dams, we couldn't provide all the power. So there's just no way. Hydro can't do it. But you can pump the water, say, uphill during the day and then let it flow during the night, and then it's unlimited. You can store as much as you want. You just can't harvest as much. Now, wind power is really cool because it can coexist with architecture. So here are these happy cows under the wind turbines. And that matters because if you say you want to convert 15% of the US to wind turbines, that doesn't mean that 15% of the US can't grow soybeans. It means that a small fraction doesn't. So in a wind turbine, it works just like a child's toy. The wind blows and makes it spin, and that wind is created by temperature differences. So the important point is if you have a bigger wind turbine, the amount of power you generate increases as the square of the size. So if you double the size of your wind turbine, it's like getting 4 times as much energy. So you want to make really big wind turbines. And you want to put them up in tall places because wind is higher as you go up. You know, if you're lying on the beach, it's all fine. And then you stand up, you have to go to the snack bar and you're freezing, that there's less wind near the surface than above. So you want to put up big wind turbines on high towers. And it turns out that because of that effect, the energy you generate goes as this cube of the wind speed. So if the wind goes from 2 miles an hour to 4 miles an hour, that's a change in a factor of 2, you get 8 times as much energy. So that means that high winds generate much more energy. So this is a picture of a wind map of the United States where blue and purple are good. So you can see right down the center, there's this great opportunity for wind, and also on the coasts. And sort of in between, it's not very good. So there's not much point in putting wind turbines in places without much wind because of that big difference. So the summary of wind is siting is crucial. You want to put them in windy locations and large rotors and tall towers. And you have to space them out by about this much. And because if you have one right behind another, you're blocking it. Right? If I stand in front of it, there's no wind that goes behind me. So you have to have a space between them, and that's what gives you the amount of wind you can have per area. And again, the nice thing is it coexists with agriculture. In some areas, wind is already cheaper than fossil fuels. So this is the electricity generated by wind in the United States. And you can see, unsurprisingly, there's a lot generated in that area that was windy. There's very little in the non-windy areas. But an important part is how much contribution there is. In Iowa, almost more than 25% of the energy comes from wind. This isn't a tiny contribution. It's actually very large. And on good months, it's almost half. So again, you can argue that something's possible if it already occurs. And so this is an example here in the United States of it working. Because a lot of people say, well, Denmark generated more than 100% of its electric power, briefly for a minute, about last November. And Germany, typically in the summer, can generate on a summer weekend more power than from solar than any other source. But people say, well, those are Europeans, and well, Europeans are European. So if we ignore that whole part and say, okay, we'll ignore them and just look at people in Iowa where lots of presidential candidates are eating bad food, you can see that you can actually do very well. And that even there, people are managing 50% energy. So what about solar power? Well, this is something that really annoys the crud out of me. So what's 1365? Probably it's an important date in medieval Europe, but what it actually refers to here is sunlight. It's the amount of sunlight that falls on a square meter if you are a satellite facing the Earth all of the time. Of course, if you've got a house in Boston, you get somewhat less power than that, and this is a more realistic number for a house in Boston. So a lot of people say, wow, solar power, you know, you can cover Harvard University and get the power for the United States. Like, no, there's a big difference between these two numbers, and it's important to use the more realistic one. So what happened to that 1365? Well, one is an issue of angle, that as the Earth turns, you get less sun shining on the area. And so that lowers you by about a factor of 2. And the position in latitude can lower you. But if you're clever, you change your solar panel so it actually points toward the sun. And it happens that we are really smart in being located about 45 degrees. So roofs here are fabulous. So if you put solar power on the roof and you have a south-facing roof, you brilliantly point it directly on the sun. So you don't need to put it up. It just works nicely. So this is how much power you can really get. And so red is good here. And unsurprisingly, the Southwest desert has a lot of power, 30 to 43 watts. But Boston isn't so bad. It's 22 to 29. So a really important difference between wind and solar is wind, it really matters where you are. You want your wind to be in a place that's windy. But solar doesn't make much of a difference. And it scales with size, unlike wind. So it's really advantageous to put solar panels on your roof. And you can get plenty of power that way. And this is a very nice piece of information from Bloomberg. They say that next year, solar power will be cheaper than the grid in 36 states. So it's no longer an issue of how much you want to give up. You actually can make money doing solar power. And I just wanted to mention geothermal is another option. Again, it isn't everywhere. There are a number of issues with it, but it's an alternate source of renewable energy that's less cyclic. So I've so far said that on average, you can generate the total power used in the United States. But for those of you who are sort of lawyerly, you might have worried about that on average and the little asterisk that came next to it. And so now I have to own up a little bit about averages. So the average age of this group of people is 45. And so you can say, gee, they're all born in roughly 1970. However, the average age of that group of people is also 45. And neither of them was born anywhere near 1970. So one has to be very careful in statements about averages and actuals. So let's go back and face up to this issue of the difference from the average. So solar energy, the number one problem is it gets dark at night. At night, you generate very little solar power, and there's not a lot you can do about that. So this is a graph for the state of California of the hourly solar power. So it peaks in the day and goes down at night. And you can see it's a little different as it goes across. So that's a fundamental problem with solar. You have to find some way to manage it. Wind varies on a daily basis, but it also varies on a seasonal basis. You know, spring is generally windier than other seasons. So if you look at net power generation, you have these fluctuations. So this is an issue. People want exactly the power they want when they want it. And if the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, what are you going to do? And one answer is use a lot of natural gas. But let's figure out how much you can do other than that. Can we handle these fluctuations? Well, so far I've focused on supply, but it turns out the demand varies too. So here's a picture of how we use energy in the United States. And notice that there's a peak along that windy area. So that's kind of good. They have a lot of wind, but they use a lot of power. So it's situated in the right place. And the variations are huge. If you look at Rhode Island, it uses the least power. If you compare that to Wyoming, which uses the most, there's an enormous factor between them. It's almost a factor of 5 in the power use in the United States. And it's not even about cold, because you'll notice that Vermont and New Hampshire, which are quite cold, are actually doing substantially better than Texas. So there's a lot of cultural issues involved in that, but the variation in the US is roughly the same as the variation between the US average and the average in Lebanon. So it's a really, really huge variation. It's important to keep that in mind. Our demand also varies with time. This is US demand fluctuating. And it fluctuates seasonally, and it fluctuates during the day. So supply fluctuates, demand fluctuates, and this creates a big problem for power companies. This is an actual graph of demand and price. And you can see these huge spikes. This means that they brought some highly unused power source online that's costing them a fortune. Right? This is $450 per megawatt. It's huge, vastly bigger than what they're charging over here. So what power companies are doing is trying to manage fluctuating demand with fluctuating price. But what that means is that we shouldn't think about, gee, renewables fluctuate and that's terrible. Demand fluctuates too. The key is trying to figure out how to manage them together. And again, this is the data from Iowa showing that we can already do it. Iowa manages something that produces half of their energy from wind, and they're doing okay. So here's a clever use of California. This is their total energy use. This is their renewable production. There are 12 hours where even though the demand is changing, solar is coming on because the sun is rising. So it actually keeps the demand constant. And that's what power companies would like. They'd like to run their power plants at exactly the same time. So here, fluctuating renewables are not a bug, as my programming friends would say. It's a feature. That fluctuation is actually helping you manage your problem. And that's an important lesson here, that combining things makes a difference. So I'm a good Cantabrigian type person, so I say we should celebrate diversity. And in this case, I don't mean people. What I mean is power sources. And this is the daily energy use in California. And you can see they mix all these power sources. And one of the clever things they do is they use hydropower right after the sun goes down. So that allows you to balance those two renewables nicely and have a larger total fraction from renewables. So is switching to renewables too costly? Well, one thing you ask is, what is cost? When my daughter was little, we used to remind her to shut off the light in her rooms because otherwise the polar bears would suffer. And it actually worked till she was about 12, and then she didn't care anymore. But you know, that was a good 6 years there. So you've got to think about this issue of, well, it's not just what we pay on the electric bill. What are we doing to other creatures with whom we share the earth? What are we doing to the air we have to breathe? And what are we doing to the political people with whom we have to deal? So when you're thinking about cost, it's important to think about not just what you pay on your credit card at the pump, but these other things that are also costs of the way we use energy. And again, I want you to remember that we waste more than half of the energy we extract simply because of that Carnot efficiency. So when you're talking about cost, one thing to look at is retail price. And you'll notice that retail prices also vary a lot. Hawaii is 34 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas Louisiana is 7. Again, a factor of 5 variation. So when you ask, should I install solar power on my roof, depends a lot on where you live. The reason Bloomberg says it works in 36 states is because in some states where electricity is really cheap, it's not going to help you a lot. How much it helps you depends on how much it already costs. And what you can see is those states that didn't use that much energy have really high costs for energy. So supply and demand are working there. So if we look at costs, how big is this cost? Well, this is an estimate from the US government of what the overall cost is for different energy sources. And so this is the cost for natural gas, which is the cheapest. And you can see it's lower than anything else right now. Natural gas is the winner. But if you add carbon, for example, then you get this little extra square, and you get the line going across. Now, several renewables become competitive with natural gas. But the situation is more complicated and better because, as I pointed out, there isn't one cost for power. This is San Francisco's power structure. And if you have good eyes, you can try to chart all that. It depends on whether you're rich or you're poor, whether it's off-peak or on-peak, whether it's winter or summer. So I've simplified it by saying this is the maximum California price. It's way above even solar thermal. So there's a range of times where anything you can do is way cheaper than what they charge. And even for Alabama, every single energy source is below their maximum price. So looking at average prices can be deceptive. The maximum prices are significant. And then the minimum prices are down here. So far I've been talking a lot about sources. What I now want to talk about is how we use it. So this is, again, the graph of what we use. And for petroleum, we use almost all of it for transport. And transport turns out to be really ugly. Car energy efficiency is horrifically terrible. This is a graph from the EPA of driving in the city. 84% of the energy is wasted. So you take this oil out, you extract it, you ship it, you refine it, you do all this, and then you blow it all on heat and pollution. So it's really not a very good system. If you go to an electric car, you do very much better. You use roughly a quarter of the energy by making that switch. Highway driving is a little less good, but it's still a significant improvement. So you win a lot by switching over to electrical cars. So the fruits of the revolution here, this is a Tesla Roadster, and you'll notice that it has all those cute windmills behind it. And the reason is because if you plug your lovely, fancy, energy-efficient Tesla Roadster into your coal-fired power plant, the total emission you get out of this object are actually worse than driving around in your Honda Civic. So though you look better, you aren't actually improving the environment at all. It matters not only what you drive, but where you get that power. On the other hand, if you get it from renewables, obviously things work much better. So my message is you want to drive a cool electric car, but you want to plug it in to a renewable energy source. And one of the neat things about this is you can think about it in another way. So far, we think about energy storage as a big thing the power companies should do. There should be grid-sized storage. But there isn't grid-size shampoo, for example. You guys all have shampoo, right? And so if you think about the total shampoo storage, it's large. But it's not because there's a big shampoo reservoir that we all run to every day to wash our hair. Everyone has his or her own little shampoo. And you might occasionally run out, but basically you're good. You can think about energy in the same way. Tesla is now selling a home energy storage battery, which stores roughly 3 days. So if you have your home energy storage, you're good. You don't have to depend on Manhattan Light to provide you with grid-style storage. Each of you can have your own little storage, like having your own little shampoo. And that really changes people's relationship to energy. It means that supply and demand are uncoupled at the local level instead of at the global level. And that offers significant opportunities. And other possibilities that we have here are to change the way that we consume energy. So one option is to switch from regular light bulbs to LEDs. And again, I'm a little behind the curve. The revolution is here. I believe it's illegal in Australia to sell incandescent light bulbs. And there was apparently a big headline on Fox News that it's illegal to sell 100-watt light bulbs in the United States. And that's not actually true. There was a big story about what is actually true. It's not illegal, you just can't buy them. And there's a significant difference between those two things. And so this is already happening. And I was at Home Depot the other day, and you can buy one of these for about $6. So the days when I would go on the internet and find that obscure Chinese company that would sell me an LED light bulb for $40 are gone. I can go to the grocery store or the Home Depot, and I can pick one of these up. And they're important because they use energy in a fundamentally different way. In the same way electric cars were better because they didn't waste all that energy from heat engines, light bulbs are a problem. Anyone old enough to remember the Easy Bake Oven? It was a lovely little device. Small girls got it. In those sexist early days, it was all girls. Now, of course, all children can get Easy Bake Ovens. And it's harder to get a light bulb to plug into it, but you can have an oven. So you get your Easy Bake Oven, and you plugged in an incandescent light bulb, and it got really hot. And you could cook little cookies and cakes and brownies, and that was sort of cool. But the point was it got really, really hot. And so the problem with regular incandescent light bulbs is they use something like 80 to 90% of their energy generating heat. And if you're really cold, that can be an advantage. When I was at graduate school in MIT, sometimes it was really cold, and I had an old oscilloscope that was powered by actual vacuum diodes. So it got really warm. So I'd come in from the cold and I'd wrap myself around the vacuum diodes and get warm in the morning. But it's not really a very efficient way to do things. And similarly, if you're under the lights in Broadway, you can get really hot. But that's not the way you really want to control heating and lighting. It's good to decouple them. So people are already making this change. You know, a typical 60-watt replacement uses about 4 to 6 watts. So you have this enormous improvement, and they now work pretty well. They look pretty much like regular light bulbs. They turn on pretty well. Unlike those fluorescents that had that horrible purple color, you know, I could tell walking through the town of Belmont who was being energy efficient because they had this weird purple light coming out of all their windows, and you could tell what they were doing in there. So it's advantageous now to have light that looks warm and cheery and like the sun, and this has already happened. This is the second really important one, and this is one of those things that make you doubt salespeople, because a salesperson for this could say, this is more than 100% energy efficient. And you're like, tell me another one. And how is that bridge in Brooklyn doing? And I want oceanfront property in Arizona. But it's actually true. They are more than 100% efficient. And the trick that's involved is that if you think about a cold winter's day, you think, oh, it's really cold. But from a scientific perspective, it's actually pretty warm. That scientifically, 0 Kelvin is really cold. That has no energy. 0 centigrade, which is where water freezes, is 273 degrees Kelvin, which sounds pretty toasty. It's sort of, you know, where you make garlic bread if it's in Fahrenheit. So 273 sounds pretty good. So the thing is that on a cold winter day, there's still a lot of heat out there. What the heat pump does is steal some of the heat from the outside and push it inside. So the energy it uses is to transport heat from the outside to the warmer inside. Normally, heat goes from the hot to the cold. But you can spend energy to ship it in the other direction. And that energy required can be much less than the heat that you ship. And so that's the advantage of these devices. It's fundamentally different and highly efficient. And you can also make different sorts of refrigerators. So by changing technologies, you can make big changes. And finally, I'm going to talk about advantages of using information technology. That, you know, some years ago, the price of the electronics in a car came to exceed the price of the steel. And this is now true in a huge number of devices. And people now have smart refrigerators and smart toasters, et cetera. And you wonder how smart they really are. My smart toaster is not that smart. But the idea is that they're supposed to be computer controllable, et cetera. And I want to give you some examples of places that can work. And one is a rather silly one, which people have known for a while. Traffic uses a lot of energy when everyone's just sitting there at the stoplight getting frosty and screaming at sports radio. So it's better if you can just keep moving. People will be happier. So it's possible to key the lights to make maximum traffic motion. We have enough calculation power to sense in real time and organize better motion. That's a huge advantage. And like the other changes I talked about, it makes people happier. Most people do not like sitting in traffic and cursing things out. So that's a place we can feel better. This is another advantage of being able to have control. This is the sort of heat pump I discussed before, but now it directs the energy to where you are in the room. So instead of heating this whole hall, right, some seats are empty, that there's no reason to be warm over here, though if it's really smart, now that I'm standing here, it's going to make me warm. So you can have a device that simply tracks to put heat where the people are. So if you're just, if you're just sitting in one place, you can have the heat directed over here. And there's the added advantage that you'll feel like St. Francis, because all your animals will love you and gather around, because it's the only warm place in the room. So if you want to make sure you're really appreciated, get one of these and turn the heat down everywhere else. Your animals shall gather. So this is an advantage of being able to use smart systems. Another is the fungibility that I talked about. It turns out that in Florida, they have serious brownouts in the winter. Anybody think why? Why does Florida have a problem in the winter? Because people have electric heaters they rarely use. So if it's suddenly a cold day, everyone turns on their electric heater. And it's a brief problem, but it's a big problem. But in Massachusetts, we can be using less energy then and being able to share it back and forth. In August, right, we had a brownout in Belmont the other day. I was working on the slides for my talk, and I was all psyched, and everything went off. There went 20 minutes of work. And They brought the power up, obviously, in about 30 seconds. But an opportunity to share power would also save a lot of money. Those power plants that were costing $450 a megawatt hour are because they're rarely used. If instead you can spread supply and demand more effectively, that's highly efficient. If you can also turn your demand, do I need to run my dishwasher right after I finish dinner? No. And yes, there's a programmable thing I could do, but do I remember to do that? Rarely. But if a smart system figures this out for me and makes those adjustments, that's great. So by controlling how we match supply and demand, we can have a big win. And this is just an example of an app that tells you where a parking place is. So instead of circling in mad frustration, you look up where a parking place is and go to it. So that saves you a lot of driving around maniacally. So in sum, I'm suggesting that we can make large changes in the way we use energy that have the potential to really have a positive impact on our lives. We can help national security, balance of payments, have everyone breathe easier. Canada can be less mad at us for all that acid rain we don't like to admit we send them. Climate change can help with a huge number of problems that are becoming more acute. Everyone can breathe better. Rich Mueller argues that living in Beijing is equivalent to smoking 40 cigarettes a day. This is not good. And being able to change that is important. And being able to move things around. So instead of having excess here and a shortage here and a shortage here, being able to smooth that out in an intelligent way is a big advantage. And finally, we can all feel better if we don't have to sit in traffic and suffer all these other things and just have the system magically keep us comfortable wherever we go. Thank you very much.
So I just want you to know that I've done my part for being a good citizen. I bought a Volkswagen turbo diesel injection car last year. So I just want you to know that I'm doing my part. Not. Thank you.
This is why I walk, Melissa.
That talk filled your head, right? I had an error message in my brain, storage overload. But there is a book, I just want you to know. But
you can also do replay. That in the wonderful world of the web, you can do this thing where you back it up and you play it again.
There were a lot of plots. Are there any questions in the audience? Yeah.
Gary.
Can you discuss your feelings about the future of nuclear?
Feelings are always so bad. Anyone who knows me will tell you I do not do feelings well. You know Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory? I was really good and did not wear my Superman shirt today. So I don't think that I'm absolutely the best person to address the feelings issue. But looked at it from another perspective, I would say that nuclear is a different kind of problem. That it's not a technical problem. We can certainly run nuclear reactors. There have been nuclear subs. France has generated 70% of their energy for a long time. But there are three critical issues. One is what you do with the waste. See Yucca Mountain in the endless loop. A second problem is how we deal with rare events. We're really good at things where we can get statistics. As we well know, if we have a nice Gaussian distribution, we can evaluate the tails, we understand it, we're good, we can do insurance. But for things that are really rare, we don't know how to evaluate them. What's the probability of another Chernobyl or Fukushima? Very difficult to tell. And so to do the trade-off between, well, how much do we benefit from these features of nuclear versus how much we suffer if something goes wrong is very hard. And it's way above my pay grade to do that economic risk analysis. But I think that's the fundamental problem. And being essentially sort of a coward, Custard the Dragon and I have a lot in common, that my feeling is if I can skip it, I will. Because there clearly could be a downside. And if we don't need to risk it, I'd prefer to avoid it. But I can't make a definitive case one way or another because the issues are too hard to evaluate given the rarity of the bad events.
So one of your slides said
Yes.
and a couple of different things. The energy that we're now using mostly is owned by somebody and sold to somebody else.
Yes.
And the sun isn't really owned by anybody. So isn't that a big impediment in our changing our ways? Because somebody's going to lose a bunch of money if we change, when we change.
Well, that goes back to the computer science bugger feature thing. And for some people, that's a big bug. And it's arisen as a big question for power companies about whether solar energy should be sold back to the grid at the retail price or the wholesale price or the retail price at that moment. And there's a huge debate about that. On the other side, it's an opportunity to change our sense of power and control and potentially to build community. That if it's an opportunity to say, okay, I live in Arizona and I have a honking big solar array on my roof, and it's not only enough to allow me to air condition to -6 until I'm freezing, but it also allows me to do that for 3 of my neighbors, that changes the public utility control over anyone's energy use to something that's more individual. So I think that there are both advantages and disadvantages and winners and losers. And we're going to have to decide as a society how we're going to let that evolve. People who are going to lose always fight. Anyone who loses an opportunity is going to be unhappy about it. And so I think it's a period of huge change. I used to work for Bell Labs, as Melissa said, and boy, it was fun to be there and be a monopoly funded by the public who was forced to pay those phone charges. And it made a really good life for me. And that's all gone, and they've raised the building, but phone charges are way cheaper for everyone. And bums me out a little that I can't play with my toys so freely, but overall I think it's good for people. So I think it's a change that is going to happen whether we want to or not, and how we adapt to it, I think, is a very important issue.
What are the statistics on the materials that make up solar panels? How much do we have actually, and do we have enough materials to actually make all the solar panels we would need to have all this energy?
Well,
rare earth materials. And what are the environmental impacts of mining those or all that?
Well, that's a good question, but solar panels are dominantly silicon. So that's not so terrible, it's sand. So from that point of view, we have a lot of it. You're right that if we go for exotic solar panels with the high efficiencies, there are many serious issues associated with that. And that's what's used in satellites because they want to have high efficiency. But if you can live with okay efficiency, typical efficiencies are about 15% now, then it's not such a bad problem. Whether there's manufacturing capacity to keep ramping up for that, I think it's an engineering problem and not a problem of fundamental lack of resources. But if you go for the exotic materials, it's an issue. And you bring up an important point. You have to dispose of stuff for all these things. What are you going to do with the wind turbine when you're done? And it's important to think about that. You know, how much the wind patterns change? How will that have an impact on local climate, et cetera? That anything we do that changes the world changes the world. And it's very hard to project all possible consequences forward. But there isn't an immediate catastrophe associated with using a silicon-based technology. But whether it can scale forever, I'm not sure.
You talked a lot about the supply and demand and how that shifts and how that fits into your picture of the energy revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to know a little bit more about the particular areas of technology that you need to kind of match the supply and demand. For example, you mentioned Tesla, but a lot of the consumer problems there right now take a couple hours to charge. Or even like wind turbines, batteries aren't able to capture the energy as efficiently. So which of these areas of technology do you see as most crucial to address at this point in time?
Well, I think it's several on different levels. That in terms of solar power, the big change has been that Tesla as a company is now selling those home batteries, which do a couple days of power. So it's now quite feasible for you to go completely off the grid. So that decouples you altogether. And again, the storage isn't solved at the large scale, it's solved at the small scale. So if you want to spend that money, and I think it's roughly $5,000, you can have this object that will store the energy for you. So you can completely unplug from the grid and not care what they think. It's all yours. And that just does you, or maybe your neighbors if you're feeling generous and you have that extra left over from your air conditioner in Phoenix, but it's a local issue. For larger scale issues, part of it is the smart grid, that the Obama administration has been aware of this for some time. If you Google smart grid, you'll get, thousands of pages of various things. And the idea is to take that power grid that is existing in the United States and link it up more effectively so that you have a broader geography. Some things improve with distance. Wind turbines separated by about 1,000 kilometers don't have the same gusts, but they have the same seasonal issues. So that isn't subtracted away. So there are various subtleties. In Germany, for example, it turns out that wind power peaks in the winter and solar power peaks in the summer. And it happens that their current supply of wind and solar roughly exactly balances. So both of them fluctuate separately, but together they're almost flat. So a lot of it is doing clever combinations of saying, okay, stop thinking everything has to be stable, everything has to be steady, and go to a changed world of, okay, all of these things are fluctuating, but if I have enough connectivity and computing power, I can try to balance them in a good way. Similarly, if I can get the customer to say, I'll control your demand, that keeps me from having to use those expensive power plants. So the ability to communicate, react, and calculate, I think, is one of the biggest factors. But there are these local things, too, that are changing, like the solar power. So I don't think there's any one answer. I think there are different challenges. Italy had a solar eclipse a while ago, and apparently it messed with their solar power, and everyone went into a panic because there was this sudden decrease that they then had to manage. So it's still a work in progress, but I think that the idea is not to try to make it stable, and that's really hard for engineering-minded people, but to accept change and try to have the change well synchronized to meet supply and demand. Yes?
You pointed out it's a complicated problem, connection between supply and demand, different time scales, and geographic variations, multiple time scales. Has anybody attempted an overall look at this to construct a scenario that in some period of time would convert us to renewables and try to get products out of that model like costs?
Yes, a number of people have done it. There's a wide literature. There was an article that I read by a Hungarian group about 2 years ago, basically saying wind power in Europe can never do it because of the seasonal variation. That wind power all over Europe is seasonally coupled, and the variation is so large that there's no cost structure that would make it effective with wind alone. On the other hand, one of the themes I've tried to have is no power source is going to do it alone. And they were considering only wind. And I said Germany balances that well with solar. So that there's a lot of cost analysis in how to combine things. When do you turn on the natural gas? When do you use less effective plants? The advantage of natural gas is it turns on and off rapidly. Coal is much harder to turn on and off. So power companies already balance all these factors to try to make it cost effective for them. It's not a change in paradigm. It's just a different set of variables that they're balancing. But can you do it with no non-renewables right now? I don't think so. But natural gas is serving well as a balancer. It emits a lot less carbon than burning coal, for example. And I think that's going to be a transition for some time. And what the total transition is, I'm not certain. But yes, people are very worried about that and spending a lot of time on it.
So I'm going to ask us to, I think Mara's happy to stay here and answer questions if people want to come down. And I'm going to ask us to thank Mara again for a really great talk. And again, thank you for coming, and please come down and ask questions.